in the Zurich area, as I just said, I've been in crypto for a couple of years now, which feels like a lifetime, but pretty active locally in the community, working with the Web3 team, and I'm pretty active in the Polkadot space. So this is the first of our 2022 meetups. I see a couple familiar faces from the one we did last fall, which is great. We've got a really cool presentation tonight from Jonas about the economics of Polkadot. And he's going to talk about the mechanics around the pools, staking, validators, all of these things that you probably want to know more about. I think it's a pretty small group tonight, so if you want to ask questions while Jonas is presenting, I think it makes it much more dynamic rather than sitting through a big presentation and waiting to the end. I'll be moderating for those that are participating remotely and kind of handling all the questions that come in online too, because we are doing a crowdcast tonight. It's pretty cool. Before I turn it over to Jonas, just a reminder, this is a kind of a blockchain mechanics discussion in Polkadot. We don't talk about price. We don't talk about any sort of reward, financial advice, anything like that. That's all up for you guys after you go to the bar later to talk about the future. Specifically for Web3, that Jonas is not allowed to make any comments on those sorts of things. So you can ask the question, but you'll just be wasting a bit of air. But I think with that, I'll hand it over to you, and welcome.
Okay, yes. So thank you everybody for showing up. I will present today the economics of Polkadot. My name is Jonas Gehrlein. And before we start, I show you a little bit more about myself. I'm a behavioral economist working as a research scientist at the Web3 Foundation since June 2020. And I'm focusing on economic questions related to the protocol and especially how humans interact with it. So because of my background, I'm very interested in the psychological aspect of this. So how are people actually responding to the incentives and how do they interact with the protocol? I'm doing some ongoing research on validator selection, where I want to improve the user experience when actually looking for validators that are suitable for denominators. I'm doing this in an online experiment, and maybe this is a part for you to participate later. I give some more information there. And I'm also looking at the candle auction in a laboratory environment. So as you all know, we on Polkadot kind of give away the right to be part of the protocol in candle auctions. And from a theoretical perspective, it's very interesting to see how this performs, because it's in auction theory, there are some concepts like, for example, efficiency, where you want that the good actually goes to the person with the highest valuation. And this is not guaranteed in all the auction formats. And I actually want to empirically test this, but I'm quite confident that the candle auction performs very well. But I want to kind of prove this in the laboratory. Then I'm also doing a lot of data analysis. I'm looking a lot on on-chain data, especially in staking. So whenever we have discussions internally about which changes we want to propose to the protocol, it's always good to actually look at the data and see which of the things make sense. And I'm also doing a few quantitative reports. Hopefully some of you read my analysis on the first Kusama and Polkadot auctions. They are available on the Polkadot blog if you haven't read them yet. And I'm also doing qualitative analysis. So especially in the first Kusama report, I also included a lot of results from interviews and surveys that I did with Parachain projects and also with community members. But you see, I have quite a bunch of different methods, and I try to tackle problems from different angles here. So at first, I want to give you an overview what you can expect from this presentation. So which pieces are there actually in the puzzle or in the economic puzzle of Polkadot? Because probably if you're familiar with the protocol, it is quite complex and it has a lot of moving parts. And I want to give you some intuition about the mechanism and incentives that each of those different puzzle pieces have, and also how they are interrelated with each other. So I will not, so I will assume some basic knowledge on the protocol. So I will not start with what is Polkadot. So I assume a little bit of background knowledge, but still it should be for everyone, hopefully. So we have this puzzle of Polkadot economics, and I asked myself, which are the different pieces? And I came up with 6. The most obvious one is tokenomics, so the dot token and the inflation model. Then we have, of course, staking, the nominated proof of stake mechanism that is used and what it means for decentralization. Then the Treasury, which I think is currently underutilized, but gets improved over time. And I think also people underestimate the impact that the Treasury can have in the future. So this basically means the maintenance and the evolution of the network itself. Then the Parachains, so the slot mechanic that there is on Polkadot and the opportunity costs of blocking bots. And I won't actually look into the details of any of the Parachains themselves. I rather want to show you what the impact of having Parachains actually mean for the protocol. Then another very important aspect are the slot auction, so the economics of the crowd loan and the candle auction. But I will leave this out for this presentation because this gets too much. And also, I think Bill had a presentation on this last time. And then also a very important part are bridges. So whenever the protocol kind of bridges to other ecosystems, this poses like new challenges to the economics. And this is also super interesting, but it's also outside the scope of this presentation. So we'll focus on these 4 things. So basically, Polkadot, in my opinion, is a layer 0 protocol that offers shared security to its shards and incentivizes the efficient usage of participation rights. And hopefully, within the presentation, I kind of can give you the background on this quote. So let's start off with the tokenomics. So most of you probably are familiar that we have the dot token, which is the native token of the Polkadot network. And essentially, 1 dot is equal to 1 E10 planks. And planks is the smallest unit of account in the system. So essentially, the protocol itself does everything in planks. So that's the smallest unit of account. And 1 dot is just a user interface agreement that 1 with 10 zeros of planks equals to 1 dot. Some of you might know that 1.5 years ago, there was a redenomination. So before 1 dot was 1 E12 planks, I believe, and now it's 1 E10 planks. So whatever happens on the blockchain, essentially, or the protocol is denoted in planks. And just the user interface of, for example, Polkadot.js assumes that 1 E10 planks is 1 dot. This is actually a reference to plank length, which is the smallest possible distance in physics, or also plank time, which is the smallest unit of time. And the dot token is a utility token with several different use cases. So you can have governance with it, so you can participate in votes. And this actually leads to decentralization, right? So kind of the ownership of the protocol is distributed to all the token holders. Then you can bond dot tokens in these slot auctions. And as we see later, that the whole utility of the network comes from these parachains. Then, of course, you can also use them in staking. And staking actually provides the security that is necessary for the parachains to work. And of course, you have message passing. So whenever you do a transaction, you need DOT to pay the fees. And one big example, of course, of some transaction, it would be a transfer when you want to send DOTs from one account to the other. But essentially, all interactions with the blockchain require some transaction. And there are like many more different transactions where you need the DOT token for. So let's then look into the inflation model. Inflation is just the expansion of the token supply. And the main source of inflation in the protocol are the staking rewards for the validators and nominators. And we have some central economic variables in the model. Some of them are exogenous. That means they are like outside of our control. They come from outside. And that would be the staking rate. So that is the total amount of staked tokens divided by the total amount of tokens. So if 50% of the tokens are staked, of all available tokens, you have a staking rate of 50%. And then some endogenous variables, like endogenous to the model, which is the optimal staking rate. We will see on the next slide that everything kind of evolves around this optimal staking rate. And this is somewhat like this notion of sufficient backing that we want to have, like we want to have some optimal staking rate in the system so that the security is kind of guaranteed. We also have a targeted inflation rate of 10%. Then we have different states of the DOT token that comes from the utility or from use cases before. They can be liquid, so that you can use them to send around, to pay actually transactions, and also very importantly, liquidity on the markets, of course, for efficient price discovery and so on. Then you can have them bonded for staking. As you know, on Polkadot, you have a bonding period of 28 days if you want them for staking. That's essentially the economic mass that is behind the staking system and guarantees the security of the network. Then you can also bond them for Parachains, and that is where actually the demand of DOT tokens come from. And we also see this a little bit later. And the goal is to obtain some sensible ratio between these different states of the DOT token. And in some earlier version of the presentation, I had here optimal ratio, but that suggests way too much that there is like a specific ratio that that is like optimal. It is more about some sensible ratio here. And we will see that currently the staking rate differs from the optimal staking rate, but that is in no way a problem. Okay, so here is the inflation model. On the y-axis, you see the percent in annualized terms, and on the x-axis, you see the proportion of DOT that are staked currently. And we have two functions. The blue one is the inflation reward for the stakers, and the green one is the staking rate or the staker rate of return. And as you can see here, that everything revolves around this ideal staking rate, which is currently 75%. So that is at the that is where the inflation reward for the staker is at its maximum, and this kind of incentivizes to increase or decrease the staking rate relative to the deviation of the optimal staking rate. I think the most important point here is that the inflation rate, so whatever the stakers are earning, is at its maximum when we reach the optimal staking rate. So I think not many people know this, but essentially what we do when we are not in the optimal staking rate is actually not reduce or differ the inflation, because that would lead to actually changes in the inflation, which is undesirable, at least in my opinion. What we actually do is those staking inefficiencies are transferred to the Treasury. So instead to be paid for the stakers, so the validators and nominators, they are transferred to the Treasury. Does that make sense?
Any questions so far?
Any questions?
And how does the Treasury manage it centrally, completely, or by Web3?
No, it's decentralized. Yeah. I will also talk about the Treasury later. So let's look at the current situation. You can find interesting parameters, of course, on polkadot.js.org apps. And this is Polkadot, and we can see that the ideal staking rate is 75%, and the current staking rate is 53%, which is quite a deviation. But that's actually not a problem, because 53% is still super secure. And as we will see later, we are currently between models, because the rollout of Parachains just came recently. And you can see the inflation rate of 7.8%. But actually, this might be a little bit confusing. This is only what the stakers are getting. So we are still at 10%, but 2.2% go directly to the Treasury, because we are not in the optimal staking rate. The same for Kusama. And here we can see that the ideal staking rate is actually 60.5%. And the staking rate is 42.8%. So talking about adjustments, we closely observed the ratio between the different states of the spot token. And of course, we saw that there's a deviation between the ideal staking rate on Polkadot and the current staking rate. But we already proposed some changes on Kusama, which are actually implemented that kind of scale the ideal staking rate with the amount of parachains. And this is quite intuitive. The more parachains you have, the less there is stake that actually can be staked. So you want to decrease the ideal staking rate, but only until some threshold where you say like, okay, this is a reasonable lower limit where we don't want to go below. And I believe on Kusama, that's 30%. So it scales with the number of parachains until it reaches a minimum of 30%. And as you saw right now, we are at 60.5%. And actually just yesterday, I opened an issue that hopefully this ideal staking rate or this mechanism on Kusama will then be implemented on Polkadot. And when I say like we implement or whatever, it of course just means that we propose the changes and then governance votes on it, right? So we can't do any changes on the system itself. We just make reasonable propositions and then it is accepted or rejected by governance. And also the situation, especially on Kusama, is heavily influenced by this bootstrapping process because, and especially in the first parachain auctions, a lot of DOT or Kusama were locked, and they will be released in, I think, a month or two from the first batch on Kusama, and this kind of changes everything again. People, decide to restake them and so on. So we kind of wait until the system kind of gets into an equilibrium, and then we can again check how the different ratios are. So just a little side note on inflation. In the fiat world, kind of inflation has a very negative connotation right now. High inflation rates are everywhere in the media. And it's also a general discussion in economics. But my take on this is that actually predictable and moderate inflation, such that on Polkadot, is actually very good because it incentivizes to work with the tokens, for example, to bond for good parachains, and actually also to just use it on the network, because the opposite, like the deflation, so when the value of the token just increases without dilution, then the economic activity could halt and people would hoard the tokens and actually would not be willing to do anything with it, and that would kind of stall the economic activity. So yeah, in my opinion, inflation is quite good, and especially if it's predictable and moderate. So let's go on to staking. Let's look at the concept. So as you know, we have the nominated proof of stake NPOS protocol as consensus mechanism, and essentially what this means is that it's just the election algorithm. This is just how the active set of validators is determined. But there is an economic incentive system that is built like very closely on top of this, which aligns the incentives of nominators and validators with those of the network. And what this means is that good behavior is rewarded with staking rewards, and malicious or neglecting behavior is kind of punished or slashed. And currently, the minimum total stake on Polkadot is 1.8 million dots. So that's the minimum total backing a validator needs to get into the active set. And this is, quite the economic mass that is behind even one validator. And on Polkadot right now, there are like 297 validators. A cool thing of NPOS is that the total stake is actually pooled from validators, so the Sap Stick, and their nominators, so the Delegated Stake. And this allows for a high degree of inclusion. So as a validator, you don't need to come up with 1.8 million dots yourself to be able to validate on the network, but it can be pooled with your nominators. And this means you can start a validator with as little as 1 dot. And then, just it depends on your skill and your reputation, on how well you can actually get the nominators to follow you and to delegate the stake to you. And on the other hand, it still guarantees a lot of security because this stake is actually pooled. And the goal of this whole concept is to get as much skin in the game as possible, both from validators and nominators. The skin in the game of validators, as I said before, is the Sap Stick. So whenever they are getting slashed on their Sap Stick. Then the reputation, they have a reputation, and if they are slashed, or some of them have a registered identity, which kind of is entangled with reputation. And when they are slashed, they also lose this reputation. And also they lose future rewards. So whenever you think about a slash and then the validator drops out of the active set, that validator actually loses out on all the future rewards from self-stake and commission. And that's actually a cost that a validator has to consider. And for the nominators, it's of course the bonded tokens that they bond for the validators, because this would also get slashed if the validator that the nominators delegate to is also slashed. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
What's stopping someone simple attacking the? You say validators losing on future rewards. Why can't you just simple attack that? Why can't you set up a new validator?
I mean, you could, of course, you could, but you lose everything which is regarding to reputation, right? So if you are have an identity and you just register something new, you would lose out on this. And actually, it's very hard to get people to delegate their stake to you.
Yeah, okay.
So you
off the nomination side, it's difficult to get back up to where you were.
Exactly.
You a new identity.
Yeah.
That's the cost then.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, either this or come up with the tokens yourself, which at 1.8 million dots is quite hard, right? So yeah, the total stake in the system actually directly translates to economic security that it provides, because this is the stake, or this is what it's at stake, and whenever validators misbehave, we can slash them, and that's quite costly. So let's look at staking rewards, and that might be a little bit detailed, but I think as probably who's nominating right now? Okay, not that many. Okay, but still, I think it's very interesting for nominators to look how the rewards are distributed. So based on the inflation model that we saw before, there is a total error reward, so a total amount of tokens that will be distributed to validators and nominators. And that's once per day on Polkadot, for example. Then the validator receives their share relative to the error points that they have compared to all the error points. And error points are kind of a performance track of validators, and they get error points for producing blocks. And potentially other things. So what this means is that if a validator produced half of the blocks, that won't happen, but just imagine, then of course he gets or she gets 50% of the rewards. Then this is split according to this ratio. Then the validator takes their commission, so they can set up a commission for their service. They can say that we have a 10% commission if you nominate those. And then they get the 10% from this. And whatever is the rest of this flows down to all the nominators. And there the nominators get rewarded based on their share of their stake to the total stake. So when a nominator has 50% of the stake of a validator, then they also get 50% of the share. Does that make sense? Just a little side note here, the self-stake. So the validators are nominating themselves. It's just treated as a nominator. So what are staking rewards actually for? So for validators, it's the hardware that they need to provide, the networking, and the maintenance costs. And it's actually quite challenging to set up the nodes and especially monitor them. So because they need to have an uptime from almost 100%. That's quite challenging. And for nominators, it's actually the curation of the active set of validators. So nominators actually have a job of finding the best possible validators and sorting out the validators that are not very good. And this kind of on aggregation, if you have thousands of nominators, this has some kind of invisible hand mechanism where by wisdom of the crowd, you should sort out over time the bad validators and only leave the good validators in. So nominators are actually compensated for the effort that they provide there and also for the risk, of course. Since your stake is slashable, you need to compensate people for this risk. So let's look at validator selection. So how do you actually select validators? And as I said before, the job of nominators is actually finding suitable validators. And that was actually one of the first challenges that I had when I was interacting with the staking protocol, was actually, you see these thousands of different validators. And then I asked myself, so how can I even find the good ones, right? So which one should I actually choose? And here the nominators face several trade-offs between, for example, security, performance, and decentralization. As I said before, the kind of the self-stake is the skin in the game of the validator. So potentially you want to have this quite high, but you might know that person, and then it's fine if it's a little bit lower, or a very performant validator could be operated by an entity that has a lot of different validators, and you might be interested in decentralization and say that, okay, it's fine when I have a little bit less performance to actually vote for those guys that have only a few nodes. So, and the evaluation of this trade-off is actually highly nominator specific, right? So it depends really on your preferences. And ideally, you also include variables of historic time series on this. So how was the performance over time and so on. And that's quite challenging. So I want to actually make this easier. So as I said before, the economic background on the self-stake is a main indicator of skin in the game. So when you don't know the validator at all, then it's probably good if you choose a validator with a lot of self-stake, because in the case that they screw up, they actually lose a lot of money. Then another thing to realize is that higher commission, ceteris paribus, so if nothing else changes, just this identical validator, but one has higher commission than the other one, leaves the validator kind of with higher incentives to behave because of the future rewards, right? So if they screw up, they lose out on more rewards in the future, and therefore they should behave more better. Then there can be various sources of trust. I actually, if you're more interested, I have a blog post on this, so nominating and validator selection. And there I kind of disentangle the different pieces of how this trust is formed between a nominator and a validator. So how can you trust your validators? And I think I have three main sources, which is communication, reputation, but also economics. So for example, a high self-stake would be an economic variable that you can actually trust. And yeah, as I said before, I'm doing ongoing research there, and later I can share more.
One question.
Yeah.
So anybody with a stake of 1.8 million is immediately a validator, or is there an upper limit to the number of validators?
So it depends on how much stake is in the system, because the the NPOS protocol kind of tries to equal that out between the nominators, between the validators under some constraints. And so basically what it means, if in the last era you had 1.8 million as minimum stake, then the probability is super high that if you can manage to get 1.8, you will be elected in the next one. So it's kind of, I mean, if for some reason the stake doubles in the system, so we go from 10 million dots stake to 20 million dots, then of course the minimum stake increases.
Okay, so we change the level, like 1.8 can be 2, or...
Yeah, because it scales with the limited amount of validators that we have. So we only have 297 slots right now on Polkadot at least, and this needs to be distributed somehow.
How are the block confirmations and determined for the validators? Are they based on total share that they have, or is it completely random?
It's completely random.
Completely random between 269.
Yeah. So in theory, everybody should get the same error points. So everybody should have the same amount of blocks produced. But this can vary actually within error just by chance. You can be lucky and produce 20% more blocks than the other ones just because of luck. But over time, if you take 100 errors and every validator is always active, then this should actually even out. But there are maybe other factors such as infrastructure and latency, because if a validator doesn't produce a block, then he kind of misses out and another validator jumps in and produces the block. But under like perfect conditions, all the identical validators, over a decent amount of time, everybody should produce the same blocks.
Yeah, that's why if you look at the validators on like the telemetry maps, they tend to be located closer to high speed connections, Frankfurt, and these sorts of things, because the block return time, even though it's awarded fairly, if the block return time is a bit slower, you can still lose out on producing the block.
So is the nominator out then motivated to find the one that's closest to 1.8 million?
No, that doesn't. The old 1.8 million is just the threshold to get active. Once you're active, every validator is the same. But what you're right is you want to find actually the validator with the least total stake, because then your stake has the biggest share of the total stake of that validator, which could increase your reward. But that is not related to the error points or to the block production.
Isn't the reward uniform across all nominators though?
It depends on your share.
On the validator. One
so
has nominated.
It depends on you. So it depends on your share, of course. If you have more dots, then you get more. And it depends on how well your validator performs. And that, as I said before, can be luck, or it can actually be not luck. But you can find validators that have higher performance. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And I don't know if I got lost, but the nominators, who are these?
Everybody who has dots. I think there's right now a lower limit for this, but it will be resolved in the future. So whenever you have dots, you can be a nominator. You can bond your tokens and then just nominate some validators, and then they produce stacking rewards.
What sort of distribution is this between the different validators in terms of the stake behind them? Or is that relatively uniform?
So the NPOS protocol, I believe, tries to make this as uniform as possible. But since nominators have the option to choose their validators, it works under the restriction that actually it tries to allocate your stake to only the validators that you are choosing. And therefore it can vary, right? The stake varies, but it should, So,
but then because the price of becoming a validator is set by the market, then everyone is becoming a validator at a different amount of stake.
This I don't understand.
So the 1.8 million is dynamic, right?
Yeah.
So the marginal validator that joins might be paying a different rate to the previous validator, might have a different stake to the previous validator that joins. Does this produce large fluctuations over time, like the first validator versus the last that got added?
So, it fluctuates based on the staking rate, right? So if the staking rate would increase by a lot, then the minimum stake would increase. If that answers the question.
No, but discuss later.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, then let me go on with Parachains. What are Parachains? Just briefly, Parachains are essentially the layer 1 part of the protocol. You can think of them as blockchains on their own, and they actually run in parallel. Right? This is why they are called Parachains. And they can be highly domain specific and have a high flexibility in their architecture. So parachain teams have a lot of flexibility in how they design actually their own parachains. And they all share the same messaging system. So there's a messaging standard XCM, and that makes them interoperable because they can exchange messages through the relay chain, and they are all able to kind of understand the messages that are passed. And right now on Polkadot, we have 13 parachains, and on Kusama, we have 27 parachains. And as you know, Kusama is somewhat the test network of Polkadot. So whenever there are changes, it first happens on Kusama, and then it is checked how it performs, and then it transfers over to Polkadot. And the number of parachains on Polkadot should follow the number on Kusama. What is important is that the state transition function, so kind of how the parachain decides on whether a transaction is valid or not, is registered on the relay chain. And that means that validators are actually able to validate that everything is fine, or that the state transition of the parachain is fine, without actually knowing all the data on that parachain. And that is kind of where the scaling comes from, or is at least part of it. Then we have the collators. They are kind of the entities, the nodes that kind of keep the parachains alive. What is important is that they are not needed for security, right? They just need to keep the parachain alive. And in the worst case, if all the collators are malicious, they could potentially censor transactions. So they could not relay the transactions or whatever is happening on the parachain to the relay chain, but it only needs one honest collator who eventually passes on the message, and then validators are able to validate it. So yeah, actually, collators are not important for the security model. That's my main thinking. And then, of course, parachains are offering the utility to the whole network, right? So these parachains have different use cases like distributed storage, distributed computation, DeFi, and so on. So that is actually where the use or usability or utility of the Polkadot network comes from. So let's talk a bit. Yeah.
Do actually all validators always validate all the parachains, or are validators assigned to certain parachains?
They are assigned randomly.
Okay, so
and even right now, I think not all the validators are actually parachain validators. So there's this notion of validator and parachain validator. And then there's a random selection that kind of lets a few validators validate on the parachain. This is actually also where the scaling comes from, right? Because not everybody needs to validate everything. It's like randomly determined, which makes it super hard for validators to actually know which parachain they will be validating. And therefore, it's also secure because we have like probabilities where it gets super low that you know which parachain will be validating.
Yeah. And this is once per epoch, or how often is this changed?
It's a good question. So I'm not quite sure. I'm actually not sure. It might be once per epoch, yeah. But I'm not sure.
Where do validators get the pre-state or the state transition function? Like you just get dynamically assigned to a new parachain. How do you execute the state transition function after knowing the pre-state?
It's just on cryptographic proofs. So essentially
Okay. You supply a part of the is a proof of witness for whatever you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one couldn't run multiple validators for the different parachains.
What do you mean by that?
So for whatever amount of parachains there are, one couldn't have multiple nodes operating on each of the chains validating for one validator.
Are you talking about collators? So or validators on the relay chain? So the validators are kind of assigned to the relay chain. They are kind of flying around there, and then it says like, okay, you validate this parachain, and they go there, and they go back, and they in the next block they validate the other parachain, and so on.
So it's always random.
Yeah.
Just because I know that I'm just asking because you probably heard of Cosmos. There you can run multiple validators on all the different chains. And
Yeah.
that's totally different.
Yeah. yeah, that's a different scaling model. Yeah. Right now, so on Polkadot, it's like all the validators are within the relay chain, and then they get allocated to the different parachains to validate. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the parachain slots, which are essentially the access to the network abstracted into the notion abstracted into the notion of these slots. So actually, the access to the security that the relay chain provides, and they are leases kind of 2 years on Polkadot and 1 year on Kusama. So whenever you win a parachain slot, you have 2 years as lease period on Polkadot and 1 year on Kusama. And there are only a limited amount of slots available, and that is not an arbitrary limit or like an artificial limit, but it's actually caused by networking and technology boundaries and so on. But what this allows is actually that we can use economic mechanisms such as the candle auction to kind of auction off or to allocate those scarce resources, right? Because it's
one of the questions that came in was around this, and it was how many parachains will there be in total? Is it 100 parachains into the Dot and Kusama ecosystem, or 100 each, or 100 in total, or could there be more?
Yeah, so I actually don't know the official numbers there. So I think what's safe is that we want to scale on a relay chain to 100 parachains, and then we need to reevaluate the performance of the network and so on, and then potentially scale it further. But the goal is 100 parachains. Yeah, so as I said, so if there was no limit on the slot, amount of slots, then of course you wouldn't need an auction because you could just give it to everybody. But actually, it's kind of also good in my opinion that there is a limit, because then it puts pressure on actually provide that parachains are providing value. The tokens that are bonded in these auctions are held trustlessly in custody on the relay chain. So for 2 years, they will be held and then transferred back. And the economic intuition here is that, so the tokens cannot be used for anything, right? So they can't be used for staking, they can't be used for transacting, liquidity, or governance. And this creates opportunity costs. And that's an economic term which basically says you could do something else with the tokens, right? So one obvious thing that you could do with the tokens is stake them. And then you would get like 13% staking rewards. And this is actually what you lose out. So what this actually means on economic terms is that the parachains need to compete with those costs and generate benefits that exceed these opportunity costs. So for example, in a crowd loan, so when the project tries to gather funds from the community, they need to provide kind of rewards that match those opportunity costs. And that is kind of costly, and a parachain team needs to be really sure that it works and so on. And then later, when they are active, they need to renew their lease period, and this kind of also needs the parachain to have sufficient economic activity on chain that kind of justifies this renewal. And then also the slot mechanism, since it expires, creates a constant demand for DOT tokens. And just to summarize, so it's costly to be and remain a parachain, and this kind of leads to some kind of natural selection mechanism where only useful parachains will be part of the network, and the other ones will drop out over time or are not even able to pay for the leases. Yeah. So, and now, yeah.
How much have these parachains gone for in the auctions?
I wrote the reports, but I can't remember the numbers. So I think on Polkadot it was like a couple of million dots in the first auctions. I think 5 million on Moon River, something like this. And right now on the recent slot, which will be in auction sometime soon, the crowd loan has around 350,000 dots already. Yeah. And you always have to remember that those dots are paid back, right? So essentially, it's not the costs. The dots are not the cost itself, but the opportunity costs, right?
They held in the Treasury for the 2 years.
No, they are just locked on the relay chain. So what do parachains get? And this is very important. Parachains pay for security, right? They pay to get the security from the relay chain. Because in our kind of scaling model, every parachain is as secure as the relay chain. And if you saw maybe one of the recent interviews with Gavin Wood on, I think it was a Defiant on YouTube, he said quite nicely, Polkadot is a security alliance, and it has network effects, right? So the more parachains there are in the system, the more secure it gets, and the more it attracts good other projects. So we are actually not only scaling the number of transactions, which is very commonly referred to by with Polkadot, but actually we're also scaling security. Because if you imagine that kind of security, especially in proof of stake system, is of limited size, right? Because there are only limited resources available. And whenever there is a new chain that tries to secure itself, then it draws from this cake and uses those stake as to secure itself. And this is somewhat a zero-sum game, right? Whatever you take for your chain is kind of missing for other chains. And if you think like super far into the future, when there are like a lot of different chains, then it's not really suitable that every chain secures itself. And that's also kind of the utility of Polkadot, that it kind of shares the security between all those different parachains. And what this kind of means is that securing 100 parachains is kind of cheaper or takes less stake than if 100 parachains secure themselves. So any questions on that so far?
Maybe how does the demand interact with the limit in the number of parachains? Because if the demand for parachains is lower than the limit, then you basically get slot for free, right?
Sure.
So
you would get the slot for free, but right now that's not the case. If we look on Kusama, actually the first slots were a lot of tokens were locked there. I think I can't say the number, maybe I'm wrong, but 300,000 Kusama or something, and then it kind of dropped down to 10,000. And I think that is especially the case of this bootstrapping kind of process where there were no parachains at all. And then there were all these parachains ready to start, right? And then they all came in, the hype was big, and people were just locking their tokens. But I think over time, it should even out, and also the tokens that are locked per slot should average out. But you're right, if there's no demand, then the prices would fall, or like the prices, the amount that is needed for a parachain slot. But that's actually what we want, right? If the demand is low, then the outcome of the auction adjusts. All right, then let's go to the last topic, the Treasury. So what is the Treasury? Just briefly, the Treasury is an on-chain fund that holds DOT tokens. So it's basically an account that has a lot of DOT tokens, and it's governed by all the token holders of the network. So everybody that has DOTs can vote in how to spend these funds. The funds come from different sources, from transactions. So whenever there's a transaction, a small amount of the fees go to the Treasury. And then also for slashes. So in the case that there is a slash in the network, this is generally reported by one validator onto another validator. So if one validator finds out another validator is doing something bad, then it reports it. And if it comes to a slash, then this validator gets some small kind of finding fee. and the rest is actually transferred to the Treasury. And there's also some kind of concept behind this, because in the design phase of the protocol, so I wasn't there, but probably people thought that in the case that there are a lot of slashes in the network, something is really going wrong, right? There might be big bugs, or this network needs to bootstrap itself. So actually, in these situations, it is required to have a lot of financial resources in terms of DOT, right? So that the chain can somewhat secure itself again. Pay people to find the bugs, to fix the bugs, and so on. So this is actually a reason why this amount should actually be transferred to the Treasury, so it can be used for these kind of stuff. And then by far the biggest part, as I said before, comes from staking inefficiencies. So whenever there's a deviation from optimal staking rate, then it is transferred to the Treasury. So actually it's not lost, but it's actually still in the system. Through governance, which I don't want to explain here, but there's some governance process. Everybody can submit proposals and initiate Treasury spending. The Treasury currently holds 26 million DOT, which is quite a lot, which is nice. And spending is kind of incentivized by a burn mechanism. I believe it's once per month, 10% is burned. So actually there's an incentive to spend the DOT tokens. But also if there is burn, then it's actually not that bad, because it's, the supply is reduced, which should benefit all the token holders. That's actually the only place where tokens are burned.
Very good question. I mean, one of the things that's come up in the last months around governance is, if you're staked, you can't always vote, right?
If you are staking, then you can vote.
Okay, so
you mean if you're if you bond your tokens for Parachains, right?
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious to get your views on the dynamic between that. It's kind of a participation in decentralization versus the economic rewards, right?
Yeah. So I don't have an answer for this because it's tricky. You could, on the first hand, you could argue that not being able to vote is just another opportunity cost. You could argue that actually you should transfer the voting right to the parachain that you are bonding your tokens for, as if it's a crowd, for example. But also I see good reasons why the voting right should remain with the people who bonded the tokens. And I believe this is probably mainly right now implementation issues. I don't think it's trivial to implement that you bond your tokens.
It's not.
But yeah, I mean, I think I'm open for all three things. I think some discussions on this can actually lead to some things. Okay, so essentially the Treasury is a DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. And this DAO has actually access to funds, and it can make funding decisions directed by the collective. So all the token holders kind of can vote. And those token holders have a vested interest in the network. And that's actually a very cool setup, right? So the incentives are aligned. The DAO has quite substantial resources. And this can lead to very interesting development in the future. And I think that it's not fully recognized yet by the people. Because this kind of allows the chain, or gives the chain the power to fund its own existence and to improve the utility in the future. For example, it will pay for core developers to improve the protocol. So at some point, probably there's no Web3 Foundation, but actually we write Treasury proposals asking for funds for our research. As I said, so researchers to explore new direction and solve problems and conduct studies that are beneficial for the network. Hopefully, my studies will be part of this. Then it will fund campaigns to educate people about the protocol and to grow the community. And it can also incentivize the development of common good parachains. Those are parachains that don't really have a business model, but offer some core functionality to the network. And since they are common good, like nobody really wants to pay for them, but the Treasury could. Right now we have a common good parachain which is called StateMine or Statement, and there I think you can mint tokens similar to the ERC standard, and those collectors, for example, they could be incentivized by the Treasury.
So as one of the questions that came in earlier, which I think is relevant now, is what kind of economic research is most needed for the Polkadot Kusama ecosystems? And then the follow-on was, would the Treasury fund this sort of research?
So nobody knows whether the Treasury will fund this, right? Because it's a collective decision by everybody to vote on this. But I think the chances are super high that if there is a good proposal on a research question, that the Treasury will fund this, definitely. For the best economic research questions, probably we would have to sit together to discuss this a little bit. I think there are. But yeah, right now I can't just think of something, but
Okay.
there definitely are.
Your contact details are at the end of the
Yeah, definitely. You can reach out to me. So yeah, it's, in my opinion, it's a truly decentralized and self-sustaining organization, and this will be super interesting how it evolves in the future. Actually, it already does. It's Treasury in action. Maybe some of you know that there's a Pioneers Prize initiative, where the goal is exactly what I said before, so propelling technical innovation on the Polkadot network. And the total amount of 1 million DOT tokens are allocated to the program. And it should incentivize research on zero knowledge, proofs and cryptography. So that's probably increasing privacy on the protocol. And infrastructure research, which I believe probably is networking, to even further scale the network. So it actually, the Treasury already kind of proposes some interesting research areas and provides the funding for people to jump in. I believe not all the details are yet finalized, but this actually will be part of the Treasury funding in the future. And yeah, this basically means that the Treasury is paying for its own evolution. So how does this all fit together? So in my opinion, the relay chain kind of shares the security, it grows the ecosystem and incentivizes development. This is passed on to the parachains. They contribute their utility to the network, so they are useful for the network, and they bring in more people. Actually, people want to use that stuff. This translates to the DOT token, which should increase in value, and thereby it increases the security of the network, which then in turn can sustain or secure more parachains. The Treasury has more funding to again grow the ecosystem and so on. So this is kind of some cycle which you could think of. So what are the takeaways of this presentation? Polkadot is a layer 0 infrastructure that offers shared security and cross-chain messaging. Security scales, so it's less. It takes less stake to secure 100 parachains than 100 individual chains. The DOT token kind of captures the utility that the parachains provide, and it converts it into security. And the slot mechanics, so the renewal and the auction, create a market where parachains need to outcompete opportunity costs to be sustainable. So that kind of means they need to be useful. And Polkadot as a DAO will fund its own preservation and evolution. So as I said before, you can actually participate in one of my studies, so validator selection studies. It's ideally you already nominated on chain. That would be good. So you actually have some background knowledge on this. And there is a small DOT reward upon successful completion. And if you're interested, write me a quick email. Actually, I don't want to give you too much information because that would compromise the study, but it will be about validator selection. And also watch out for announcements in Polkadot and Kusama direction and water cooler channels. And you need an Element account to participate. So if you haven't already registered in one of these channels, then please do so. So yeah, that's my presentation. If you have any questions,
Going back to the Treasury and its function, does that also provide a certain level of floor price for the Polkadot, for the DAO?
In what sense would that?
That there's enough in the Treasury where if the price of DAO drops, it could drop to zero. Right? Is the Treasury built in such a way where it provides safety, sort of a floor price?
No. I mean, the Treasury is nothing else than an account which has funds like DOT tokens. And to spend those DOT tokens, people have to write a proposal, and this will be discussed off-chain mostly. And then it goes into the governance process where council needs to approve it at first, and that eventually it will be decided on by the token holders. And once the vote is successful, there's just a transfer of the funds that are requested to some other account, and that's it.
It's not a central bank in how we think about it.
Yeah.
Also, one question regarding the Treasury DAO. So you have to explicitly bond your DOT to the Treasury DAO, or are all nominators and validators also part of this DAO basically?
You essentially bond your tokens to vote, but it can, once you vote, there's these kind of conviction rates where you can give your vote more weight by locking it longer. But essentially, if you are fine with not having additional weight, then you can just vote without locking.
Okay, so you either nominate your DOT for validators or become a nominator, or you are part of the Treasury.
No, you can do both.
You can do both.
Yeah, you can actually bond your tokens and stake them, and with this bond, you can vote in governance.
Okay. Now your staking rewards bonded to your voting participation, and if you vote more, you get more stake.
So it depends on so when you bond your tokens to stake, you can determine what happens with the stake that you produce. It could just send back to the account itself. It could send it back to the account itself, then bond and increase your bond for staking, or you could just send it somewhere else. So it actually depends on what you do. But once you have the tokens, you can vote with the new tokens just as before.
Okay, no, but what I meant was more that if you stake your DOT in the DAO and you don't participate,
You don't stake your DOT in the DAO. What do you mean?
Participating voting.
Yeah, it's just voting. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah. So the staking rewards, are they all denominated in DOT? Or,
I mean, they are.
or may they vary according to what Parachain validator is allocated to?
Okay, that's so.
Because some of them do have their own native asset, like Glimmer or whatever.
Yeah. So if you are staking on the relay chain, kind of, or validators of the relay chain, then your rewards are in banks, essentially, and Parachains are kind of their own system, right? So whatever they do, the relay chain doesn't care very much about it. So it could be that some parachains offer also staking, and I guess then the staking rewards are in the native token of that parachain.
Typically, that's the case.
Typically, but I mean, it doesn't need to, right? I mean, they can come up with anything that they want.
Some parachains have variable rewards that are set by the validators. Others set the rewards fixed. At a fixed rate, so it really depends on the parachain.
But that's independent of the relay chain validator reward.
That's correct. Yeah.
So that's like a whole.
Think of it as kind of two separate.
Yeah.
The relay chain gives the shared security and the commonality for the parachains, and the parachains kind of have their own build and their own use cases.
Yeah, talking about the staking rewards. Actually, the staking rate. I was wondering how you actually choose this confidence interval where staking rate should stay so that.
Yeah, it's like this. Yeah. So as I said, it's optimal staking rate might be overemphasizing it. It's some kind of reasonable ratio, and it was decided kind of. I wasn't there when the model was proposed, but in the absence of parachains, you could much else than having it liquid or staking. This is why it was chosen quite high at 75%. But I talked like internally, like going down to 20% of staking rate would still be super secure. It depends also on your threat model, like how would you attack the network and so on. So, and these kind of different things, but it's not that if it goes to 40%, 30%, there's actually some security issue. It's just.
And has it happened already that you have to change the staking rate because this threshold has passed, and then you have to dynamically adjust the staking rate?
So the staking rate we can't really adjust, right? This is just what people decide. If people decide to stake, then
Sorry, the staking rewards.
no. You mean that you
Yeah, like,
actually
let's say
you
it's-
change the curve?
Yeah,
Yeah, no.
because you said you vote on that in case the staking rate is
Yeah.
it's not good.
Yeah.
or too high.
But that's actually a good point. Yeah.
You just propose. Has it happened? Yeah.
No. No. But actually, it's difficult with the inflation rate, which is ideally fixed, right? So we don't want to have too much difference there. And once you start, giving more rewards, then you mess up the inflation rate.
Yeah, that's true.
But yeah, I think at some point, once as I said, everything goes into some equilibrium and we see this kind of normalizes, then we might think about additional factors to push the staking rate to the ideal staking rate.
Okay.
Maybe the incentives of that curve are not enough, and you want in each point where you are and you see that you are not moving, you might want to increase the incentives. But for now, that's not a pressing issue because there's enough liquidity and there's enough security.
And is there a limit on the staking reward so far?
Yeah. It is determined by the rule. Probably would be faster to. That's determined by this graph, right? The inflation reward, the green line is essentially what the stakers get as reward, and of course, the less stakers there are, the more the individual ones get, and yeah, that's the green line. Okay. Any other questions?
Can you switch to the next slide for a moment? So you say that delta here between the 7.8% and the
10%.
10% is paid out. So this means validators are getting like at 75% stake, validators getting 13% rewards, 30% ROI. You get sort of capture the difference between the 75% and 100 to get to 10% stake.
I don't know. So if the ideal stake matches the staking rate,
Yeah.
then the inflation for the reward for the nominators and validators would be 10%.
The rewards are 10%, or inflation for the whole system is 10%.
The inflation of the whole system,
So then
but
the rewards
also
would have to be compensated for the extra 25% that's missing.
no. So the inflation of the whole system then would be the inflation for all the nominators.
Be true at 100%, right?
What?
It'll only be true at 100%. At 75%, there's still if 75% is receiving 10% inflation, then 100% is receiving less than that. That's receiving 8% inflation, something like that.
You're only getting rewards if you're staking. Maybe I'm missing.
Okay. I think I'm explaining myself.
Yeah, maybe we should talk about this later. But yeah, so the inflation would be 10% if the ideal staking rate equals the staking rate.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole inflation, 10%, goes to validators and nominators.
Okay.
Yeah, let's talk about it later. Okay. Any more questions?
So you're comfortable with having a higher inflation rate when there's more stake, so to speak, it's more secure.
But the staking, actually, the inflation rate of the whole system is the same. Because this 7.8% means that 7.8% goes to staking, to nominators and validators, but the rest is going to Treasury. So the tokens are still minted. So for the whole system, it's still 10% inflation.
guys look at the opportunity costs of, people competing for parachains? Those who don't make it, they just move on to other ecosystems? That's their Polkadot. That had a problem with that at all?
To be honest, not so much, because that would involve a lot of we try to be objective in how we behave, and we don't want to analyze parachains and try to offer help to them too much in a sense. So essentially we design the whole protocol and propose the changes to, and whenever we see issues arising, then we would act on this. But so far I'm not aware of any parachains that couldn't extend their leases.
Why not extend the leases? I mean, like you have an auction, so it's basically only economically driven, right? So you only have the guys that pay the most who get the parachain, but maybe you have a parachain that is of high quality but doesn't pay the most, then
I mean, economically speaking, you could say why are they super useful but they can't pay, right? And they're need.
I mean, if you look at it, so it's all just a point of clarity. I mean, we talked about this last time, but with the candle auction, it's not necessarily who pays the most; it's who has in the winning spot when the auction ends. But if you look at it from a project standpoint, I think a lot of them would say, does a parachain make sense, or should I build on another ecosystem? And then you have the cost of building your own blockchain, in a different ecosystem versus the cost of the of the crowd loan or the parachain slot. And the shared security and the commonality that goes around that. And I think teams will look at that. And I think if you look at a lot of the parachains that exist in the ecosystem right now, they're pretty targeted use cases. So they put a lot of thought into it and said, we're going to be this or we're going to be that. And then the crowd loan, they put that into the marketing and kind of the white paper and everything else, and then attract the attention and the bonding for the parachain slot. So. I think, I mean, it's probably the right question to ask. And I think it just depends on what they're trying to do. It might be that, a parachain could work for us, but we'd rather stand up our own, engineering and development team and build all this ourselves, which is also a way to do it.
Yeah. So how do parathreads fit into this whole economic?
So parathreads are supposed to be like a mechanism which is kind of pay on the fly. So right now, you on the parachains, you kind of reserve the right for 2 years on Polkadot to include your blocks on the relay chain, and parathreads are somewhat designed to that there's some kind of auction mechanism where you pay that it's included. So a fixed amount of slots will be reserved for parathreads, and there is actually competition between the parathreads to include their blocks on the relay chain. But actually, I'm not on top of the development of parachains too much, so I can't give you much details there. But that's the whole idea, right? So you have this kind of pay on the fly model, and that might be interesting for blockchains that don't need super frequent transactions, maybe oracles, which need to publish a price once per 10 minutes or something, maybe like this.
Yeah, I think it's related back to the previous question of kind of what's right for you, right? And I think right now, parachains, the slots are not filled up. So as the ecosystem grows, a lot of people will look at it and say, okay, does it make sense to go for a parachain, or can I do the pay-as-you-go method? For whatever my use case. Oracles is a good one. It might be more efficient and more capital effective to do it that way.
True, but since it has an economic impact, the ratio of kind of slots for parathreads and chains kind of influences how much kind of the lease is worth compared to paying the go, right? There's a lot of slots.
Yeah.
Enough slots are for parathreads.
Yeah. I think it's, as I said, I'm not on top of the development there, but it's definitely an open question of how many slots do you want to allocate to parathreads compared to parachains.
And it's kind of market forces, right? Fast forward 2 or 3 years, and there might be massive competition for parachains, and it might push some of the let's say the smaller projects down into a pair thread model. I think it's just kind of, I mean, don't forget that the Polkadot Parachain auction just finished late last year, and the first chains launched in the beginning of this year, so it's still really early days. Cool.
Cool. And thanks for listening.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
thanks everybody. I think we'll stick around for a few minutes, grab some cool drinks, open the windows again, get some fresh air. Make sure you get a t-shirt, and thanks for coming. There will be kind of a post meetup questionnaire. If you can fill that out, that'd be great. Helps us improve for the next ones. And I think some people were talking about finding a bar and going around and talking about prices and Lamborghinis. So you're welcome to do that as well.
Do I need to turn off something?
I think Elodie is going to stop the broadcast.